So, welcome back. As promised, let's delve into some of those issues that were raised in that last interview. We'll look at some of the financial implications of the pandemic, but also looking ahead to what happens next and how governments around the world can, maybe, and economies, I should say, grow their way out of this crisis. Let me introduce the panel who will answer some of those questions and help us explore some of those issues. With us, Samiran Chakraborty from Citi Group, Lord Jitesh Gadhia, who is with me here in the studio, Sanjay Nayar from KKR India, and Professor Soumitra Dutta from Cornell University. Welcome to you all. It's great to have you with us. Sanjay Nayar, let me start with you because we were hearing there from the Indian Finance Minister about the work that has gone on to support economies, and so many different economies around the world have faced very different challenges. Give us your assessment of what was done in India and quite how important that response was to dampen some of the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you. I think a lot of the countries, obviously worldwide, had the fiscal and the monetary space to both print money and give a lot of fiscal latitude. India, to that extent, was less privileged, as you heard the finance minister say, extremely hawkish on the fiscal, extremely careful on overall debt levels. And India, being a supply-constrained economy generally, with an exposure to oil and commodities, there is always the fear of inflation. So I think both on the monetary and fiscal side, rather constrained. Having been dealt with that hand and such an uncertain time with the pandemic, both 1 and 2, I think they did a pretty good job in terms of being very targeted towards where the benefits were being given on the fiscal side. I think, as you heard the finance minister say, very targeted on the basis of credit schemes for microfinance and micro institutions, extremely targeted towards the rural and the poor sector. Probably the urban sector gets a bit left out, but now if you look at the next wave of announcements, they're focusing a lot on healthcare, which I think is much required. Mm-hmm. So I would say, Ben, given the limitation of resources, very targeted. I think technology and digitization effort of the Prime Minister and the government over the last 7 years has probably paid off because these targeted benefits are going right into your bank accounts and very few leakages. And then the whole, formalization of GST, taxation being a lot more automated. You put all that together, and I think you heard the word formalization of the economy. While it's all happening in parallel, I think the impact of the limited resources that were given was actually quite impactful. Uncertain times, I don't know where it's going to look like post-COVID too, but I would say as vaccination picks pace, India should be pretty well positioned.
Jitesh Gadhia, let me bring you in at this point as well, because it's very easy for us to look at maybe the United States, the UK, the EU, and many other developed economies threw money at this problem. And the UK Finance Minister, the Chancellor, saying no one would be left behind, no one would be left out of pocket. That is easy when you have the resources. The problem comes later, doesn't it, with the implications, be those inflation or paying back some of that money. Talk to me about those implications and whether, there are different approaches here that, throwing money at the problem may not necessarily always be the answer.
Well, look, Ben, great to be here at the India Global Forum. You're quite right. If you take doing whatever it takes approach, which, by the way, I don't quibble with when you're faced with the largest contraction in 300 years for an economy. But that then leaves you with a, almost astronomical bill. I mean, in the UK, last year, our budget deficit went to almost 17%. Debt to GDP went over 100%. And to Sanjay's point, maybe economies, Western economies in general, do have the fiscal space to be able to use, but we do have to be conscious about the consequences. And just to give you put that in perspective, and I'm sure you'll come onto it, one of the big issues is, what happens to inflation, what happens to future interest rates. A 1% increase in interest rates in the UK would increase our interest bill by 25 billion. And that's more than the budget of many government departments. So you can see, particularly in the way in which quantitative easing has been implemented by central banks, and particularly the Bank of England, that makes us more sensitive, in fact, twice as sensitive to interest rate increases as we were pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and it's astonishing when we're talking about numbers that are very hard to even get our head around, aren't they? The astronomical numbers that we would never have really talked about in general conversation before, but here we are, and that money needs to be paid at some point. Samiran, let me bring you in here at Citigroup, because there is a suggestion that all of this spending is great because it keeps the economy ticking over, it keeps people in jobs, it keeps businesses functioning, but we're just storing up a problem later down the line for another generation. Is that a fair assessment?
Thanks, Ben, for having me. Clearly, there are two aspects to it. I mean, it's a bit of a mystery that we have moved from secular stagnation risk pre-COVID to hyperinflation risk post-COVID, just because of this extraordinary stimulus that we are going through. And the two aspects are one about the inflation problem, the other about the debt problem, and sometimes they have to be treated differently. On inflation problem, I think the markets are quite undecided at the moment that how long this is going to last, because there are arguments on both sides. On one side, one can say that the extent of the stimulus has been more than what the decline in GDP would have suggested. So the demand side will revert back quite fast, especially because it's not a balance sheet recession. But on the other side, one can say that, look, we are for 30 years going through a structural deflation phase because of technological revolution, because of the fact that labor share in the economy has come down. So to that extent, the wage price spiral that we had always seen, that's not going to work. So on balance, I would say that policymakers would probably get enough time to react to inflation. But the debt problem is a much more structural one. And just if I may quickly tell you the context of India, currently India's public debt has crossed 90% of GDP. And just to get this debt ratio on a declining path, India needs to nominally grow at 10% plus over the next 10 years, just for this ratio to decline. Not even trying to reach the 60% debt to GDP ratio, which was a target before the pandemic. So in that sense, it's a catch-22 situation that if you don't have enough stimulus, then your nominal GDP growth is not going to be 10%. And if your nominal GDP is not going to grow at 10%, and then your debt is anyway not going to reduce. So I think that managing the debt problem is going to be a bigger one than managing the inflation problem. But over the next 5 years, I think it's not going to be an easy challenge for the policymakers in general.
Yes, and I want to come back to some of those thoughts in just a second, but let's bring in Soumitra at this point, because Soumitra, it's fair to say this was a massive shock. The stimulus was quite rightly called emergency stimulus. It was reactionary, it was immediate, and it needed to be spent to keep those economies afloat. When comes the time that we step back a little bit and say, you know what, maybe that wasn't spent in quite the right way. We need to refocus it. We need to think about it again. We need to use the benefit of hindsight and perspective to say this is what our focus should be and the money should be channeled there and perhaps not there.
Yeah, thank you very much for including me in the panel. And I think extraordinary situations does require or do call for extraordinary responses. And I think globally we have seen many example situations where governments have stepped in and done their best to ensure the survival of the societies at large. I do think that while survival is very important in the short run, I think what is much more important is to ensure that societies are able to thrive in the future. And I think for thriving, we have to invest in the future. Investments, of course, have to come in multiple dimensions, but I really believe that the focus of governments today should shift to innovation, to creating a digital inclusive future, to environmental sustainable goals for the economy. And in the piece of research that I do on global innovation called the Global Innovation Index, we see this issue coming up multiple times. But how do different economies respond to crises? And the best economies are those that, in fact, are able to leverage these down sort of moments, crises, to be able to build for the future. In the case of India, for example, India is certainly a country with a lot of high innovation potential, but there's a lot of room for improvement. If you look at, for example, the investment of Indian corporations in R&D, it's very, very small. It's less than 1% as compared to 3% in the US, or in fact, some high spenders like Korea and Finland and Israel in the 4 to 5% range. So I think Indian industry needs to invest much more in R&D, and India needs to invest much more in digital technologies. Now, yes, there has been a lot of progress made in digital, let's say, technologies in India over the last few years, and certainly the whole India stack, the Aadhaar system, the whole JAM combination, mobile and banking within bank, that helped a lot. But Indian corporations are really in early stages of the digital transformation. And what we have observed from our studies is that if you look at the economies that do better than others in terms of overall competitiveness and creating value, the digital intensity of the economy is actually very important. So I do believe that countries, including India, we need to start focusing much more on the future. We need to start focusing on the green frontier, on how we can actually create a more sustainable, environmentally favorable, and socially inclusive environment in our economies.
Thank you. Very comprehensive, and there are a few issues there that will apply to many of our questions over this next session. Let me bring in Sanjay again, because Sanjay, it's very easy for us to be obsessed, to be focused on, to be keen to talk about a recovery, to look at how we get out of this. But is some of that talk premature? We heard from the Indian finance minister there, the first priority is making sure that there is no third wave, second or third wave, depending in the world where you live. Should we still be in crisis mode and actually holding off on talk of recovery until we know we're beyond this?
I think in the Indian context, I would say, we'll have to be a little bit more optimistic, frankly. The second wave has really exposed a very soft underbelly as it pertains to fear psychosis in the people. Savings rates are what they are. They've actually come down over time. You're faced with, as I said, some degree of inflation. Money is not that cheap in India. So frankly, it is, the way I look at this, the government is doing what they can in terms of infra spending, and that seems to continue unabated, which is excellent. Again, the limited amount of resources, you heard the FM say that it's targeted towards infrastructure. I think the private enterprise needs to jump in with both their feet, both their hands, and try to contribute to the other side. But frankly, if you don't have the private sector jumping in along with the government to really revive the economic spirits again, the degree of unemployment, underemployment, the vastness of the informal economy, the diversity of the country, the growing pangs of medical infrastructure, the massive vaccination program, it's unimaginable that if you're not an optimist and think about recovery, where do you go from there? So I think, for one, there are some green shoots of capex, which is very, very welcome. I think we need a bit of luck. I would say the NPAs, while not worth discussing on this panel, clearly there is some easing of NPAs, partly thanks to the kind of ECLHS schemes given by the Ministry of Finance. I would say, a quarter or 2 quarters more, Ben, are extremely critical to see where we come out at the other end of COVID-2. Hopefully there is no COVID-3. Mm-hmm. So if the private spirits come back, government keeps spending with their limited resources, doing business in India for the Indians becoming easier, formalization of the economy, and an uptick in the revenues. All these things, if they come together, I think it's not unthinkable to talk of recovery and be positive about it. And look, the demographics are compelling. Let's face it. The rural sector is consuming goods left, right, and center. The urban part of the world is consuming services driven by technology and digitization. So consumption is still there. Yeah. Things can go wrong if we get into a negative spiral of being a pessimist. I would bet for the recovery, with a lot of things have to go right. And I really hope that works for our country's sake.
Yeah, and Jitesh, you're nodding along to that because we all know it's very easy for us to talk ourselves into a recession, isn't it? Because we hunker down, we stop going out, we stop spending, and actually the opposite is true. Last time I looked at the figures, in the UK alone, I think we've collectively put away about £180 billion in savings because we're not commuting, we're not going on holiday, we're not going out to nice restaurants and to theatre and to the cinema. We've put a lot of cash away, and that could spark in its own right an economic revival.
Yeah, look, I think there are really three phases to this. I think we've seen the sort of response phase. Obviously, I think we're definitely now in recovery mode, and very much it's to do with what I call the vaccine put. So how quickly can you really vaccinate your populations? And then we will get into, if you like, the rebuild mode, which is about the whole Build Back Better movement. But in this sort of recovery phase, there is a lot of clearly pent-up demand, clearly from not just consumers. And look, it will vary in different parts of the world depending on where they are in the pandemic cycle. So, you won't see full convergence or a synchronous recovery around the world. I think the UK will lead it. The US will lead it at the moment. Obviously other economies like Israel, maybe EU will follow. I think Sanjay's right for India. Really, I think everybody's putting store in sort of nearer to maybe the festive season in the third and fourth quarter. But also, I think what is important, Ben, is investment does have to follow on the heels of that. We can't just be an unbalanced recovery. And certainly in the UK, one of the things I'm quite excited about and sort of have sort of aspirations for is the super deduction, where we're effectively offering a very lucrative tax breaks for those companies that accelerate and bring forward their investment plans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know industry very grateful and welcoming of that. Soumitra, we touched there on where rebuilding will happen, what the priorities are for rebuilding and rebalancing economies, using the pandemic as an opportunity to say, we want a bit less of that and we want a little bit more of that. Give me your take on, where in the world economy should be getting the focus and where is getting the attention that it needs. And I'm thinking we may possibly have lost him. So let's see whether we can continue. There is a black box. So let me bring Samiran in at this point, and let's hope we can get
I think he's back.
Soumitra back. Oh, there we are. Let me see who we can get back at this point. Sanjay, just while we figure out who we've got the logistics with, because I think there are also a sound issue as well, let me ask you that, because the focus for India quite clearly is on making sure that there is not this third wave and spending some of the resources that are there. But is building back better just as easy as it sounds? We make it sound very simple, don't we, the idea to spend our way out of a crisis. Is it as easy as that?
I think for India, that's not an easy one. Even the capital flows we are getting are just a huge number. And frankly, I think the first test is, are we creating real assets or not? If they're just refinancing and creating asset bubbles and just unwarranted, unsustainable consumption, I don't think that's the kind of recovery we need. Mm-hmm. For the time being, yes, we do need some cyclical uptick. But I would say what's critical is to get a sustainable recovery built behind local savings. Yes, foreign savings as well, but more importantly, local savings, and to see a structural shift in consumption and investment spending. So just spending money for the sake of it, creating a cyclical uptick, and then suffering the hassles of having overspent in the beginning and created wrong kinds of capacities or wrong asset values doesn't help, according to me.
Yeah, Samiran, I think we can speak to you. We've still got comms with you. Yes, good. You're nodding. I can hear you. Look, I mean, we're talking there about the way that India responded to this crisis, where the spending was, where the focus was. Was that spending in the right place? And where, are we seeing the shoots of recovery emerging as a result of that investment?
So there are three distinct features, Ben, I want to talk about from India's response perspective.
We're not doing very well this afternoon. You're back.
So there are three distinct features I wanted to talk about. One feature is that India spent a lot of money in ensuring that lives are saved, not only for human beings, but also for businesses. The second aspect was about funding through credit guarantees rather than actual cash outgoes because of the budget constraint that we discussed about. And the third aspect was less on demand side and more of supply side reform. whether it is corporate tax cuts, whether it is labor reforms, agricultural reforms, infrastructure spend, PLI schemes. The idea was that a young, energetic country like India will not have a demand problem for long. So if we can fix our supply side issues, then as we emerge from the pandemic, then we will be in a much better shape. Now, obviously, we did not plan for the second wave. And now when the second wave is hitting and we are seeing another hit on the demand side, there is some argument for a larger demand side stimulus. It's like saying that the car is stuck in the mud. We need a big push just to get it out of the mud first before we change the engine or anything else. So I get that idea, and to that extent, I support a fiscal stimulus, but it has to be extremely targeted. We can use big data in a more effective way to make that stimulus more targeted. But in a broader sense, I think the purpose should be to ensure that we don't overdo things as well. Our high frequency indicators suggest that we are already almost 80% back to where we were pre the second wave. So let the natural process of pent up demand get completed. Then we evaluate how much is the output gap still left. And then based on that, we can decide on the quantum of fiscal stimulus that will still be required to get us over into a 6% growth trajectory, which I think our potential growth rate is at this moment.
Yeah, Jitesh, I mean, when we look at where we are rebuilding, and to use the government phrase, which is build back better, do you think the lessons have been learned as far as, what should be our priorities? Is this the great reset that we've wanted for so long to allow us to think, what do we do as a country? So in our example, what do we as the UK want to do? Where are we going to be world leaders? Where are we going to invest our time and our money and our skills training and use this as an opportunity? Or is there a danger that it's very easy just to think, okay, the pandemic is waning, let's go back to what we were doing before?
Well, I think there is a strong desire not to go back to the status quo ante, and that manifests itself in many forms. But maybe let's use quite a significant announcement that happened today in the north of England, in a place called Sunderland, you'll know well, announced by Nissan, where they've announced £1 billion investment in a gigafactory. And to me, that is a real metaphor for the type of build back better that people are definitely looking for. So it's in a part of the country which is being targeted for, what's called in the UK levelling up, but it's addressing long-standing inequalities that we have had over many decades and under many governments. But it's also targeted on the future in terms of electrifying mobility. And so to me, that is a good example of build back better. But also I think we build back different. So let's take air travel, right? That's controversial because you could say, well, look, do we really want to go back to the air travel that we had historically? We're sitting here in a wonderful Taj London hotel, and I was actually looking at the facilities earlier and just saying to myself, well, look, interestingly, we may travel less, but on each trip that we make, we may look for a more unique experience. Yeah. So you're the way in which different sectors look at build back better, I think, is going to be nuanced. We shouldn't just say, look, it's going to be K-shaped and these particular sectors are just going to tank and these sectors are going to rise. I think for each sector, there will be a story.
Soumitra, I'm going to brave our connection with you once more, and you're smiling, so I'm hoping that means you can hear me. Look, just as we were cut off, we were talking about that chance to reset and learn about what our economies are good at. What do we want to do a little bit less of, and what might we think about doing a little bit more of? And I wonder, in India's case, is this the great opportunity to say, these are the industries that will power our future. Let's get good at them. Let's focus our resources and our time and our effort behind them. Is that the way it will be?
Well, I think, every economy, of course, has to choose, what is critical for their own future. And not every economy can be great at everything. But India is a large country with lots of important problem challenges and lots of great talent. And I think if I had to use a catch-all phrase, I think we have to look at how can India build an effective green economy for the future. A green economy does not only mean zero emissions or net zero economy, but also in terms of deploying breakthrough technologies to help achieve breakthrough performance in the key sectors. So I think that's really the future of India, to be able to combine breakthrough technologies with the essential SDG goals that we are trying to achieve for the world.
I'm glad we persevered. It was great to hear from you there. Thank you all for persevering with a few of the techie issues. It happens. So I'm glad we got through it all. I'm really grateful to you all for your time this afternoon. It's been a real rattle around world finance, but thank you for your explanations. So thanks to Samiran Chakraborty, Lord Jitesh Gadhia, Sanjay Nayar and Professor Soumitra Dutta. Thank you so much for being with us at India Global Forum.